Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for finding time in your busy summers and it's summer travel and holidays and some really hot days that you're going to take some time with us this afternoon to listen to some of the work that our students do here at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. So for those of you who might not be familiar, I'm Dr. Nathan Ty. I'm the organizer of our Brown Bag Lecture Series, which we hold in conjunction the second Wednesday of every month with the Kearney Public Library. And we're, as always, forever grateful for our partnership with the Kearney Public Library to be able to bring the work that ourselves, our students, and our collaborators are doing and across a broad understanding of history. The schedule for this coming year's lecture series is coming together at the moment, but I can tell you we've got a lot of exciting speakers on tap who are going to be discussing different aspects of kind of local World War II history. We have speakers coming to talk to us about local African American history, talking about political history, talking about a whole host of things throughout the next academic year. Our August talk is going to be another one of our wonderful graduate students, Delaney Tracy, who's going to be discussing the businesses of the Frank family from the G.W. Frank Museum and kind of the economic history of this family that meant so much to kind of the early practitioners of Kearney, and that'll be on August 12th. But today we have with us, again, for those of you who are here for the June talk, is our public history graduate student, Logan Osmera, who's a graduate student receiving his master's degree in public history with us, also obtained his undergraduate degree with us originally from Big Springs, and has worked with several museums and institutions and hopes to pursue a career in museums to tell the story of how history impacted everyday people through artifacts and engaging stories, which you'll get to see some of this today. So we're very, very happy to have, once again, Logan with us. So thank you.
Cool. Can you all hear me all right? Sounds like it. Perfect. Cool. Well, thank you, Dr. Ty. And so, for this talk, we're going to be talking about the Battle of Wake Island, right? And so when I was debating on what to do the big 250th July talk about, I was racking my head. Do I want to do something about the Revolution? Or maybe the debate over the Constitution? Maybe something about the Civil War? I thought, those have already been talked about to death. I'm sure we've all seen the documentaries that are being pumped out online and on TV about the Constitution, about the War of Independence. So I thought we'd do something a little bit different, right? Because there's many events and incidents throughout American history that I feel really embody the American spirit of fighting against overwhelming odds, right? Seeing a mountain and climbing it just so it can be climbed, right? Going to the moon just so we could say we went, right? That's the American spirit to me, right? Seeing something that looks impossible and doing it anyways because we can. And so I thought to myself, what do I know that really embodies that? So I racked my brain, and I racked my brain some more. And I thought, how about the Battle of Wake Island? Which I'm going to go ahead and guess most of you have probably never heard of. No. And I don't blame you for not knowing about it. But in 1941, if you asked somebody, so what was the Battle of Wake Island? They would say, oh yeah, I know about that. You ask someone in 1942, 43, 44, 45, all throughout the war years, they would know what the Battle of Wake Island was. And it seems to have just been kind of forgotten about, which I think is really tragic because it's a really engaging and inspiring story of American perseverance. And so without further ado, since we live in a triple landlocked state, I'm going to go ahead and guess most of you probably don't know the history of the Pacific, which is fine. I'll give you a little brief rundown. So first off, the Pacific is big. It is a really, really, really big ocean. This is a view of Earth facing the Pacific, and you can see the US and Mexico right up here. And then way down in the corner, you can see Australia and New Zealand. But facing the Pacific head on, you would think Earth is just a water world. It is massive. And dotted throughout the Pacific are these tiny little islands, right? So tiny, you can't even see them. You can just barely see Hawaii there, but a lot of these small islands, you can't even see. A lot of them aren't even marked on maps. But these islands were inhabited for thousands of years before Europeans showed up, except one, Wake Island. And we'll talk more about it in a moment. In the early 1700s, going up into the early 1800s, the European empires of Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, they explore these islands and they conquer them and they, become part of these European empires. And that was kind of, how it was happening around the world. In Africa, and the New World, the Middle East, you had all of these areas that were coming under European control and influence. But unlike in the rest of the world, in the Pacific, things take a little bit of a different turn. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, you have what are called the two Pacific giants. On one end of the ocean, we have Japan. And on the other end, we have the United States. And these two countries share a very weirdly similar history leading up to the 1900s. So with Japan, Japan was very isolationist, right? Hundreds of years, it was isolationist. Didn't allow anyone in. There's legends of European explorers washing up on Japanese shores and the Japanese just executing them on the spot. They are very, very isolationist. But in 1853, the US sends a naval fleet under Commodore Matthew Perry to forcibly open up Japan to the European markets and to the American markets. So these massive gunboats sail into the Japanese capital's harbor, and the Japanese are simultaneously terrified and also shockingly inspired. Because they see all this, and they're like, we can learn so much from these Europeans and so much from these Americans, not because we think they're so much better than us, but so that we don't get invaded like they did in China or Indochina or in Africa or in all of these other places. So Japan goes across Europe, goes across the Americas, finding experts, buying trade goods, buying new technologies, bringing that all back to Japan to study it, to learn about it, and to adopt their society to this new way of life, right? And most importantly, they reformed their government, right? Up until this point, we still had the samurai class. They do away with that after a very brutal but brief war. And instead, they adopt a new constitution modeled off of the British, right? And I say modeled off of the British, it kind of wasn't. Because in Japan, they view their entire society way differently than we do. So in Japan, at the very top, tippy top of their society, you have the emperor, who is seen as the very embodiment of God's will. He is a divine figure, right? And then you have the aristocrats, and then the lonely peasants at the bottom. But the emperor is head. Nobody is above the emperor. His word is absolutely final. And so the Japanese formed their government, basically, to have the emperor at the top, the civilian government, and then the military. But a key distinction here is that the military was not answerable to that civilian government. The military was only answerable to the emperor. It's not like in the United States, where our military has to get approval through Congress or through the president to go and attack someone or to launch an action. Now, in Japan, the military is only answerable to the emperor. And this will become very important later in Japan's history. So Japan is industrializing, but they very quickly find out we don't exactly have a lot of resources on these islands, right? And so Japan does what every single European empire and what the United States did when they found we don't have resources, which is they expanded. They went to war, they colonized. 1894 to 1895, they launch a war against China, the first Sino-Japanese war. They kicked China's butt. There is no other way to put it. It is an absolute devastating defeat for China. But you know what? The Europeans have been conquering and defeating China for hundreds of years. That's not a big deal. What really changes is in 1904 when Japan goes to war with Russia. Russia is a European power, right? Many people thought that this war was going to be quick, done. Russia was just going to sweep Japan because Russia is that European power. Japan is just a lonely backwater. Well, surprise, Japan utterly annihilates the Russian fleet and defeats them on land. And all of a sudden, the United States and all these other European powers need to start taking Japan seriously. Because they have proven that they can go to war against a European power and win. So Japan keeps conquering. They annexed Korea in 1910. Later in World War I, they actually joined with the Allies against Germany, which is weird, but they do. And Germany was one of those many European powers who had various little islands and colonies in the Pacific. Japan joins and actually conquers all of those islands. And later, during the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, they actually get all of those islands. So Japan rapidly expands its empire in the span of only about 50 to 75 years. It is insane how industrialized, how transformed their society becomes, and also just how big it becomes. Which sounds familiar if you're familiar with American history. Now, America was kind of late, like Japan was, to colonizing the Pacific. We had flirted with it in the 1800s, the Guano Islands Act, which was an act that allowed an American citizen to claim an island for the United States if no other country had claimed it. And fun fact, guano is basically a fancy word for bird poop. Bird poop because it made an excellent fertilizer. But later we also then purchased Alaska, which kind of hints at us expanding into the Pacific. But it's not until the West gets settled and closed that we really start looking to the Pacific. Most famously, an American-backed coup in Hawaii overthrows their monarchy. Later, Hawaii is annexed. So that's our first major step into colonizing the Pacific. Later, we go to war against Spain in 1898, right? Famously, remember the Maine to hell with Spain. Most of the fighting happens in Cuba, but a good amount also happens in the Philippines, which is an archipelago right off of China. It's one of the biggest archipelagos in the Pacific. And much like how Japan had defeated that European power in Russia, the United States also then defeats that European power in Spain. Granted, it wasn't really a fair fight. We utterly destroyed the Spanish, but it's the thought that counts. Later, we also then colonize Howard and the Baker Islands, which are these small little islands in the Pacific. And also we, sort some stuff out with Britain to jointly control some of their colonies. But we see Japan and the United States moving into the Pacific, displacing European powers, defeating European powers. Which brings us to Wake Island. Now, most of you have probably never heard of Wake Island, and I can't blame you. It is one of, if not the single most isolated places on planet Earth. You can see it's right there. Hawaii is right there. Japan, the US are right there. It is in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And we can see here, this is a map of it. It is just barely peeking out of the ocean. I believe when it was first discovered, it was only like 23 feet out of the ocean. It is so remote, it doesn't even have rats, it doesn't have seagulls, it doesn't have anything. So it takes a while for us, the United States, to actually annex Wake Island. It is so remote that the European powers just ignored it outright. But the United States sees Wake Island as an opportunity, because telegraphs are a thing. And telegraphs, you can't just string it across the ocean with absolutely no breaks in between. That's not going to work. So the United States sees Wake Island as a great place to put a telegraph station, and also a great place to put, like a coaling station for ships going to and from China. And also, guano, bird poop, it was absolutely a thing on Wake Island. There were some migratory birds that kind of came and went, weren't really, permanent settlements on Wake Island. But nonetheless, we also wanted Wake Island because we feared the Japanese were going to take it. And indeed, the Japanese were poaching feathers and guano on Wake Island during this time as well. But the Japanese assured us we weren't claiming Wake Island, right? You guys, you Americans can have Wake Island. So we claimed Wake Island. Ultimately, the plans to build a telegraph station and a coaling station, all that, they never materialized. Because Wake Island is so deserted and so isolated that it's just not worth the effort. So it remains uninhabited until 1935. But in the 1930s, right? Wake Island becomes a vital link in the American plans for the Pacific. Because as you can see here, ships and planes and some such follow a very kind of strict line going from the United States to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, then to Midway Island, then Wake Island, Guam, and on to the Philippines and China and all those other places. Because in the 1930s, planes don't have the range that they have now. They need to constantly be stopping to refuel, and Wake Island becomes one of those stops on the way to the Pacific. And when I say planes, I don't mean just passenger planes. I mean cargo planes. I mean mail planes, right? Any mail that is coming from China and Japan and any of these other places needs to go through Wake Island to get back to the mainland. So Wake Island goes from being this completely deserted place that nobody cares about to being pretty gosh darn vital. And we can see here that Japan and both the United States, by the 1930s, are basically smashed right up against each other. Barring the Philippines, Wake Island is the closest thing we have to the Japanese Empire. Again, barring the Philippines. So American military planners started thinking, if we go to war with Japan, Wake Island is probably going to be target number one for them. Maybe target number two because we have the Philippines. And during the 1930s, American military planners have good reason to think about this. Because Japan is expanding even more rapidly. If you remember, I had said the military was only answerable to the empire, or to the emperor in Japan. That really comes to a head in the 1930s. All across the world, radicalism, fascism, and militarism are sweeping across Europe and also across Japan. Young military officers really want to expand further. They see the fact that European empires can control so much of this land, while Japan only gets Korea and some islands in the Pacific that no one cares about. They see that as a great injustice that needs to be corrected immediately. And also, as Japan is industrializing, it's losing out on so many of those vital resources. European powers and the United States, we can just buy them from our colonies on the cheap. Japan has to pay market price for things like oil, things like rubber, iron, agricultural goods. And again, the military analysts see Japan as a growing threat to the Pacific because of this growing militarism. And so Japan, they look at China, right? China in the 30s is an absolute freaking mess. No other way to put it. It is in a civil war, within a civil war, within a civil war. It is an absolute mess. And so these young Japanese officers look at China kind of like how a hungry tiger might look at a starving elephant, right? It's a meal. And so Japan's military officers basically, how shall one say, stage an attack against their own people and blame it on the Chinese, the Marco Polo Bridge incident. They use this as an excuse to go into China, and that breaks out the Second Sino-Japanese War, which later gets merged into World War II. But for now, it's a separate theater. And as Japan is marching into China, things get really, really brutal. In fact, it's kind of a foreshadow of what happens with the Holocaust during World War II. Because Japan views Chinese as basically subjects, kind of like how Europeans would view Africans or how Americans would view Native Americans, right? They are people to be subjugated, and Japan actually takes this a step further. Because Japan has something called the Bushido Code. And what the Bushido Code is it's like their code of honor, right, that samurais back in the day had. And Bushido, one of the elements of it is that if you surrender to your enemy, or if you are defeated, there is no greater shame. And when I say there is no greater shame, I don't mean there is no greater shame for you. There is no greater shame for you, your family, your bloodline, your close friends. If you suffer defeat, you are not just shaming yourself, you are shaming your entire bloodline. That is really, really radical for the Japanese military officers, and they instill this in their troops. daily beatings in the Japanese military to enforce this code are not uncommon. And in fact, the Japanese officers beat their enlisted men so much that the enlisted men take out their anger and frustration on Chinese civilians. Most infamously, in Nanking, there was a massive bout of rape and sexual assault by the Japanese enlisted men and officers against the Chinese civilians. But Nanking is just one of many examples happening all across China. And so America and the European powers look at what's happening in China, and they are not happy, rightfully so. As more and more news reports are coming out of China about horrific Japanese atrocities, America and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's the president of the 30s, decide this cannot stand. And so what they do is they place embargoes on the Japanese empire, right? Embargoes of oil, of iron, of aviation parts. And in fact, they go so far to freeze all Japanese assets in the United States. And Japan is not very happy about this, right? But Japan is basically left with two options at this point. Either one, they could continue pushing on in China, which isn't working because they're very quickly getting bogged down. China's a really big place with a lot of people. Or two, they could surrender to the American demands and come to the negotiating table. But remember what I said about the Bushido Code? Surrender is out of the option, right? Not even considered. And so the Japanese military needs to come up with a plan to fix this. So the military in Japan is consisted of the Army and the Navy, right? And both come up with two different plans, right? The Navy comes up with Nanshin Ron, which is the southern plan, and the Army comes up with Hokushin Ron, which is the northern plan. And basically what these are is it's a plan to solve Japan's resource ails, right? The Army goes ahead with the northern plan, which is a plan to invade the Soviet Union and Mongolia, invade Siberia, and take all those lands. And the Army absolutely gets its butt kicked by the Soviets and by the Mongolians at the Battle of Tonkin Gulf. So now it's the Navy's turn. So what is the southern plan, right? The southern plan is a plan by the Navy to basically launch a blitzkrieg across the Pacific. They are going to surprise attack the European powers and surprise attack the Americans across the Pacific and take all of those islands, take the Philippines, and take Indonesia. And importantly, Indonesia, massive rubber manufacturing place. If the Japanese can take Indonesia, they control the rubber, they can bring the Americans back to the negotiating table. Which of course leads us to December 7th, 1941, which I'm sure we all know, if my computer wants to work here, as a date which will live in infamy. Maybe my computer wants to work here.
Yeah, it is, yeah, okay.
Maybe if I have internet. Okay, cool. So, the Day of Infamy speech, right? Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. The reason why they bombed Pearl Harbor is because that's where all the American fleet is based out of. Japan thinks if we can sneak attack the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, take it all out, that will buy us vital time to launch our attacks across the Pacific. And although Pearl Harbor gets a lot of the attention, it was but one of the many attacks the Japanese have launched. And FDR makes mention of all of these other places in his speech.
Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya.
In the Philippines.
Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island.
So as we can see, Pearl Harbor is just one of the many places they attacked. But these are just names that I'm throwing at you. Let's actually visualize all of these places that Japan was attacking. And also, I want to visualize how fast they take over these lands. In the span of 6 months, Japan is able to conquer the Philippines, all of these Pacific islands, all of Indonesia, Vietnam, and Indochina, and a large part of Papua New Guinea and these other places. Military analysts call this the Oriental Blitzkrieg, right? Japan is using very similar tactics to what the Germans are using in Europe, of just shock attacks using mechanized cavalry and overwhelming air power. Gotta get back where we were. Yes. So now we focus our attention on the Wake Island, right? Wake Island, again, small little island out in the middle of nowhere. But the US sees what Japan's doing, all of this rapid expansion, decides we need to fortify Wake Island, right? So in June 1941, right, a couple months before Pearl Harbor, the Navy orders a giant military base to be built on the Wake Island. But Wake Island is so isolated that this military base ends up never getting built, right? A bunch of civilian contractors get sent to Wake Island to put up the last-minute defenses of bunkers, trenches, building a massive airfield on Wake Island, building bunkers, all that other fun stuff. But the Navy also sends a detachment of the United States Marine Corps, about 449 Marines under Major James Devereaux. And Devereaux is the overall commander of Wake Island, but he quickly gets replaced by Winfield Cunningham, who you can see right here. He's a Navy guy. He assumes overall command of Wake Island. But these Marines are also supported by about 68 Navy personnel and about 12 Wildcat fighter aircraft. And also about 1,200 civilian workers. And Wake Island is one of the first bases in the Pacific to get word that the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. And in fact, this is the exact telegraph that they received. SOS, island of Oahu attacked by Japanese dive bombers. This is the real thing. And Wake Island very quickly gets hit by Japanese air raids. Bombers repeatedly strike Wake Island about 13 times between Pearl Harbor and when the island is first attacked by naval forces. And all of those civilians that are on Wake Island, they don't really have any other choice, so they join the Marines in the defense of the island. They're manning anti-aircraft batteries. They're ferrying ammo to the troops. They're cooking food. They're digging trenches. They're doing all of that other stuff, right? And you remember I had said a couple of Wildcat fighters were on Wake Island? These guys right here. Now, unfortunately, the Japanese land a direct hit on the airfield during their first attack, take out about 8 of the 12 fighters. So they are left with 4 fighters, 4 against entire Japanese bombing fleets. And every single time these bombers are detected over the horizon, those 4 aircraft get airborne and do their damnedest to shoot down as many bombers as they can. And surprisingly, they do a pretty good job. Every single time the Japanese attack Wake Island with bombers, they are losing more and more and more of them. But Wake Island is also isolated by Japanese submarines who blockade the island, preventing anything else from getting there. Supplies, reinforcements, anything else. Which leads us to the very first attack on Wake Island. December 11th, a couple of days after Pearl Harbor. Right, a Japanese invasion fleet consisting of 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 2 transports, along with 2 patrol boats and 450 infantry, are launched to attack Wake Island. Right. The U.S. commander sees these ships over the horizon and realizes he is very quickly outgunned. So rather than open fire on the Japanese, he tells his guns to stay silent. Do not shoot at the Japanese until they are really, really close. That way, range, not a factor. We can blast each other as much as we want. And as they are waiting for the Japanese ships to get closer and closer, the Marines at these positions are dying to shoot at them. One actually radios in to James Devereaux, the commander of the Marines, saying, "What is that little shit doing? Let us shoot at them," right? That is how eager the Marines are to get at the Japanese. But all of these guns follow the plan, and when the Japanese get in close, that's when they throw over the covers and start blasting into the Japanese fleet. And almost as soon as the guns start shooting, a Japanese destroyer is sunk almost immediately. These are the guns that they were using to shoot at. Obviously, this is not the exact gun, but guns like these were shooting at the Japanese destroyers. And this is notable, right? These guns on Wake Island sink a destroyer, the Hayate, and this is the first Japanese surface ship lost during the war. And realizing they were ambushed, the Japanese turned tail and retreated, because they realized we're in a kill zone and this is not going to work. Those 4 Wildcat fighters then get up in the air with bombers and give chase. And they end up sinking another destroyer and later a submarine. So we can see the battle plan here. The Japanese fleet approaches here, gets into a turn to lay their guns onto Wake Island, and during their third turn, that's when the guns start firing and all hell breaks loose. All in all, the Japanese lose 2 destroyers, 1 submarine, 340 killed, 65 wounded, at the cost of 2 fighters and 1 killed. It is a devastating defeat for the Japanese. And in fact, it is so devastating that the American press gets word of it, and they love it. They can't get enough of it. Because remember, we had been sneak attacked at Pearl Harbor. We had suffered a devastating loss. And also most of Europe is under Nazi control. If we're playing a game of poker, at Las Vegas, it looks like Japan and Germany hold all the cards. And if you're placing bets in 1941, you're probably going to place them on the Axis powers to win. That's how bad things looked. But the Battle of Wake Island shows the Japanese fleet can be defeated. And very infamously, the news media, picking up on the story, misinterpret what Winfield Cunningham, the commander of Wake Island, says. Winfield Cunningham says, "Yeah, we're doing good, but we could really use more supplies, guys." The news media interprets that as, he's telling us, send us more Japs. And you can see this, lovely little photo here. "Dear Santa, send us some more Japs, yours truly, the Marines." The Japanese, again, are not very happy about this. They have suffered their first major defeat of the war, and they must right this wrong. So they assemble an even larger invasion fleet. 2 aircraft carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, roughly 4 times the infantry that they were initially going to assault the island with. And the Japanese, to ensure their troops get onto the island, literally beach these destroyers onto the island to ensure that there's no mistakes in the landing. And we can see one of those destroyers beached right here. Gunners in the air crew, right, who have been shooting down bombers, who have been helping to destroy aircraft, right, they're very quickly running out of ammo, and those fighters, those remaining 4 fighters, are getting picked off one by one. In fact, when the invasion fleet is discovered by the Americans, they actually get the Wildcat fighters off in the air. By this point, they had 2. 2 Wildcat fighters against 2 aircraft carriers and the entire Japanese fleet. Obviously, they don't last very long, unfortunately. But the Japanese commander, the admiral of this invasion fleet, actually makes note in his diary about the bravery of these Marine pilots. 2 fighters take off against an entire Japanese fleet. Those guys have honor. But nonetheless, the gunners, they're running out of ammo. They can't shoot at the Japanese boats, so they have to retreat inland. They man machine gun emplacements. They man rifle emplacements with trenches and such. And there are 11 hours of close quarter combat on Wake Island. It is an absolute slog. But Devereaux and Cunningham, they have a plan, right? Their plan is to fall back as much as they can and lay traps for the Japanese to entrench themselves, and more importantly, have great camouflage, great concealment, and overlapping fields of fire. The Marines know Wake Island, and they know it well. And they devastate the Japanese wave after wave. In fact, in some places, they actually push the Japanese off of the island. They actually destroy one of the landing zones and launch several counterattacks. But Cunningham, he receives word from U.S. Naval Command that there's no hope for Wake Island. They're not sending supplies. They can't get supplies to Wake Island. So Cunningham, realizing that a lot of the positions on Wake Island have probably already fallen, he didn't know they were still fighting the Japanese that cut his command lines, he reluctantly issues the order to surrender. Reluctantly. But after they surrender, and the Japanese take over Wake Island and take account of everything they lost, the Japanese realized that even though they had technically won, they still got their butts kicked. Remember, they had to literally beach their ships onto the island to ensure that they get there. 10 aircraft are destroyed, 21 damaged, 600 Japanese infantry are killed at the cost of 26 Marines. The news media picks up on this, and they are calling it the Alamo of the Pacific. I remember the Alamo, right? Famous last stand. The Texans ultimately end up losing, but they deliver such a devastating defeat to the Mexicans that it was a Pyrrhic victory. That's what Wake Island is to the Americans now. So how in God's name were the Marines so effective, right? Well, for one, they were concealed, camouflage, right? Their fighter aircraft were also serviced around the clock. They literally had to make parts for them and jerry-rig these things to take flight. But these aircraft, when they weren't actively bombing and firing on the Japanese fleet, were spying on them. So the Marines knew how many Japanese were coming, what ships were coming, roughly when they were going to land. Civilians also helped fight. A lot of civilians are basically made Marines, right, without training. So that helped bolster the outnumbered Marines as well. And without radar, Marines were remaining observation posts around the clock. And Devereaux and Cunningham, they also were excellent leaders. The Marines kind of hated them because they were kind of, as the Marines would call them, hard asses. But they were effective. In fact, legend says that the Marines hated Devereaux so much that they took out their anger on the Japanese. And also the Marines, they just generally have really high discipline, but especially the Marine training of every Marine is a rifleman. Doesn't matter if you're an engineer, anti-aircraft man, or even if you're a cook, you are trained to fight with a rifle. And that aids the Marines greatly when they're running out of supplies and they have to fall back and pick up a rifle to defend. And Wake Island was also just a small island they knew well. And because it was such a small island, they were able to interlock their fields of fire. And what that means is you have one machine gun nest here, one nest here, and they could shoot at the same target, right? And that really helped break up those initial landing parties. But of course, Wake Island ultimately ends up falling to the Japanese, right? The surviving Marines, military personnel, civilians, they all become POWs. About 350 are kept on the island as forced laborers. Gradually, they're shipped off the island. About 98 remain. The Japanese, believing that Wake Island's about to be attacked, heavily reinforce Wake Island, sending thousands of infantry to ensure that Wake Island doesn't fall again. The U.S. looks at that and says, we are not going to do that. Wake Island is way too heavily defended, so they just blockade the island. And weirdly, they drop leaflets and rafts, hoping the POWs could use them to escape. I get the sentiment, but Wake Island, again, is in the middle of nowhere. I don't think that was going to be successful, and no POWs actually end up taking them up on that offer. The island's garrison does end up ultimately surrendering, and the island is, of course, then returned to American control. However, if you remember, I had been talking about the Bushido Code, right? The Japanese believe surrendering brings great shame onto your bloodline. And across the Pacific, across Asia, the Japanese are committing horrendous war crimes against those Marines who surrender. On the Philippines. Infamously, you had the Bataan Death March. And Wake Island is no different. The remaining 98 POWs are actually executed under orders of the Japanese commander after a successful American air raid. Now, the Japanese had claimed after the war that actually what had happened was that these POWs had taken up arms against us and fought a valiant last stand on a corner of the island. That doesn't really work out, because we have this little rock here on Wake Island, and it's still there today. And what this little rock was while all the POWs were being executed, one of them ends up escaping. And he carves this little thing into this rock, showing, actually, no, we were being summarily executed. There was no fight. And for his trouble, he is captured again, and the Japanese commander on Wake Island personally beheads him. Really gruesome stuff. But the Japanese commander also gets what's coming to him, because after the war, he is tried for war crimes and executed by the Americans. But if you remember, I had said the Alamo of the Pacific. That word, that phrasing gets reused all over the place. News of the island's last stand really inspires the American public, right? So much so, the commander, the overall commander of the Marine Corps, Commander Holcomb, described it like this. Wake Island began the war magnificently for the Marine Corps, and America found the old soldierly virtues that are still embodied in its fighting men. Out of such actions as this, a people's strength and ultimate victory must come. America remembers Wake Island and is proud. The enemy remembers Wake Island and is uneasy. And news of the island's fall, yeah, it was sad, but it also immortalized the defenders, right? Kind of like the Spartans, the 300 Spartans, they are immortalized in the American mythos. The National World War II Museum describes it as proof that the country's sons possessed sufficient courage to crush Japan. And this is an immense propaganda win for the Americans, right? We can build all the tanks we want, we can build all the ships we want, all the rifles, we can train all the men we want, but if we don't have the will to continue the fight, what's the point? And Wake Island gives us that will to continue the fight. So much so that Hollywood gets in on the fun, and in August 1942, literally a couple of months, give or take, after the island falls, they make a film about the Battle of Wake Island, and it's called Wake Island. And it's significant for a couple of things. One, it's the first major motion picture to depict American forces in combat during World War II. But more importantly, the film is just pretty good all around. It is a major commercial success. It's one of the biggest box office hits of the time. And that big box office success massively drives up war bond sales and massively drives recruitment for the United States Marines. And the New York Times describes the movie as a film for which its makers deserve a sincere salute, a literal documentation of the manner in which the Wake Detachment of the Marines fought and died in the finest tradition of their tough and indomitable corps. So yeah, it's pretty much a propaganda film, but what they're saying is, it's actually a really good propaganda film, guys. And that whole phrase of "send us more Japs" becomes a rallying cry for the Marines and for the American public throughout the war. And in fact, here's the trailer that was made for the Wake Island film. Maybe. Why do we not have sound?
On this mighty island, 1,200 miles from Hawaii, 443 United States Marines stood guard in early December
Well, you know, Commander, my outfit's supposed to be a defense battalion. Don't see much to defend here. Matter of fact, not much to defend it with. Only Marines.
Laboring beside the Marines, fighting against time to complete vitally needed fortifications, was a larger group of civilian workers.
Mr. Plato, you got my resignation. You want to run my job or run it? I'm afraid at the moment that won't be quite practical for either one of us, Mr. McCloskey. Why not? The Japs have just bombed Pearl Harbor.
On December 7th, they struck. By the thousands, from land, from the sea, and from the sky, they battered in the tiny garrison. Those 443 Marines stood off everything the enemy could throw against them.
One of them shows that set me and murder a pretty in the chicken ranch. I thought you were all set for hogs. Hogs is out. Why? They stink.
Another signal from the enemy, sir. They demand immediate surrender. Any answer, sir?
Yes. Tell them to come and get us.
So again, I like how the New York Times describes it. Yes, it's a propaganda film, but it's also a really good propaganda film. Get back to where we were. Yes. So Wake Island is so important that even the Kearney Hub is talking about it. And we can see they're talking about it in a purely factual and, of course, neutral. I'm just kidding there. This thing is pure propaganda value to them. Rightfully so. The gallant defense of the heroes at Wake Island against the attacks of the Japs in this epic of ages. We will remember Wake Island and its heroic defenders for all time. Of course, it wasn't just valuable for the civilian war effort. It was also a really valuable lesson for the Marines and for the Navy. For a couple of reasons. For one, it showed that the Japanese could be defeated even if we were outgunned and outmanned. It also showed that airplanes were going to play a vital role in the war ahead, and that amphibious assaults required careful planning and fire support, right? Remember, the Japanese had failed at their first attempt at landing, and were so worried about failing again that they had to literally beach the landing craft. So that's a very valuable lesson for the Marines and the Navy. The battle also gave us some breathing room in the Pacific, right? It gave us about a couple of weeks to rearm after Pearl Harbor, to gather our strength, and to actually then go and launch counterattacks against the Japanese. And Devereaux's calm and decentralized leadership, his fire discipline, and making the best use of limited resources, was also taught to all and every Marine Corps officer going through training during World War II. And that whole interlocking fields of fire and camouflage, that were the key lessons the Marines took away from that. That to be successful against the Japanese in the Pacific, you needed to have multiple people firing on one position, and they needed to be camouflaged. And in fact, even today, the Marines still teach about the Battle of Wake Island to the enlisted men and to the officers, right? The battle is often brought up during Marine Corps training to instill the Corps' value of courage and perseverance against overwhelming odds. And Wake Island, right after the war, continued to be a vital chain for refueling and resupply. Ultimately, when planes got better fuel efficiency, Wake Island was completely bypassed. Eventually, Wake Island was transferred to military control in 1972, kind of after the Vietnam War. Later, it supported refugees from the Vietnam War. Then it was transferred to the U.S. Air Force in 2002 and remains so today. But it also serves as a pretty vital emergency landing strip. If you have like a Mayday over the Pacific, Wake Island is literally the only thing that's down there. It's better than nothing. And you can see the Marines have erected a little tiny memorial, basically, on Wake Island, commemorating not only the Marines, but also the Navy personnel and the civilians especially. And I want to understate, the civilians really do help the Marines a ton, right? Without these civilians, the Marines probably wouldn't have been successful as they were. And so, to end this, right, I kind of wanted to bring the Nebraska connection into this, because I was curious. Did any Nebraskans serve on Wake Island? Well, a couple of them did, right? Some Marines. One Navy guy was from Nebraska. But as I found out, all of the civilian contractors were actually from the same Midwestern company. And so, a lot of the civilian contractors on Wake Island were from Nebraska. This is a list of all of the people from Nebraska. I'm not going to go through them one by one. All of the Nebraskans on Wake Island, a lot of them were civilian contractors. And we have people from Grand Island, Wahoo, Hastings, Scottsbluff, Chagrin, Omaha, North Platte, all over the state. And a good number of these civilian contractors took up arms to fight with the Marines against the Japanese, right? And so again, average, everyday Americans, right? A lot of them growing up on farms, a lot of them having no idea that Japan was probably even a country. They are outnumbered, they are outgunned, but again, their perseverance inspired the nation, right? So much so that I actually have a little piece of propaganda here. This is a little tiny stamp, or a little tiny envelope that you could buy at your post office. And this was one of the many propaganda pieces depicting the Wake Island Marines. And after the talk, you guys can come up and see it, but it says, "Work for victory with the fighting spirit of the Wake Island Marines." And so with that, I will now take questions. Yes?
When was it liberated then? When did the United States take it back, or did they just, when did that happen?
So we pretty much bypassed Wake Island during the war. We blockaded it, but we never made any attempt to retake it.
Oh.
Later, when the Japanese surrendered, the garrison on Wake Island surrenders with them.
Oh.
Yeah. Any other questions? No? If not, you guys can all come up and see all the shiny artifacts I have here. But thank you all for coming. Very much.